Mark Reyes had become a master of doing everything with one hand. It wasn't a skill he'd ever expected to learn, back in the days when his biggest responsibility was remembering where he parked at the gym, but life had a way of handing out sudden shifts. Since his wife passed 2 years ago, everything he did with his daughter, Lily, on his hip, her chubby fingers tangled in his shirt like tiny anchors holding him steady. This afternoon was no different. Rain had swept across the town in a quick, cold curtain, leaving the grocery store parking lot smelling like wet asphalt and steaming under the fading sun. Mark dashed inside with Lily perched on one arm and a mental list of essentials repeating in his head: eggs, bread, fruit, milk, diapers, always diapers. They maneuvered through the aisles at their usual pace, slow enough to keep Lily happy, fast enough to get her home before a meltdown. She grabbed at cereal boxes, waving cheerfully at strangers who smiled at the sight of the tired-looking dad and his bright-eyed toddler. Mark didn't mind. Being a single parent wasn't easy, but moments like these made it feel less heavy. By the time he reached the checkout line, his arms were starting to ache. Only one cashier was working the front, a girl who looked far too young to be handling the late afternoon rush by herself. She wore a name tag that read, Alyssa, though the letters were fading as if the badge had been used for years. Her brown hair was pulled back into a loose ponytail, but stray strands fell around her face, framing tired, almost nervous eyes. As Mark approached, she straightened a little, though her shoulders still slumped from the weight of a long shift. She gave him a small smile, forced, polite, the kind people learn when they're expected to be friendly even when they have nothing left to give. "Hi," she said softly. "I can help you here." "Thanks," Mark replied, shifting Lily to his other hip. The toddler reached toward the conveyor belt, fascinated by the red light of the scanner. Alyssa began scanning his items: bread, apples, a jar of peanut butter. "Beep. Sorry," she whispered. Mark didn't think much of it. People apologized for all sorts of unnecessary things, he did it himself sometimes. He offered her a polite nod. She scanned the diapers. "Beep. Sorry." He blinked this time. "You're good," he said gently. "No rush." But she didn't react beyond a quick, jerky nod. She continued scanning, her movements efficient but nervous, like each item might explode if she handled it wrong. "Beep. Sorry." Now he looked up from his wallet, brows drawing together. 3 times in less than a minute. Not irritation, confusion flickered across his face. He wasn't doing anything to make her feel pressured. The line behind him wasn't long. Lily was quiet, chewing contentedly on her stuffed giraffe. The girl swallowed hard, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. She didn't meet his eyes. Mark tried to ease the tension with a soft laugh. "You've apologized more times in the last minute than I do in an entire bad day." Her hands froze for a fraction of a second on the loaf of bread before she forced them to move again. "Beep. Sorry." There it was again, automatic and fragile. Mark opened his mouth to reassure her, but she still didn't look up, and he felt something tighten in his chest. She wasn't apologizing for him. She was apologizing to something else, something invisible. Lily gurgled, reaching toward Alyssa with a grin. The girl looked at the child and her face softened briefly, the corner of her mouth lifting, then dropped just as fast, as if joy were a luxury she wasn't allowed to show. Mark noticed the small things now. How her shoulders tensed when an item slipped and hit the counter too loudly. How her eyes flinched at the sound. How she took a quick, anxious breath before scanning the next product. She seemed to brace herself before each beep, as though expecting reprimand. When she reached for the milk jug, her sleeve slid back slightly. It was only a second, a tiny, fleeting moment, but it was enough for Mark to see it. A faint bruise circling her wrist. Not fresh, not new. The kind of mark someone learned to hide. Alyssa yanked her sleeve down quickly, cheeks flushing. She didn't look up. "Beep. Sorry." This time, the word cracked around the edges. Mark felt his pulse shift. A subtle, cold realization crept in, quiet but heavy. He didn't know her story, not yet, but he recognized fear when he saw it. He'd seen it in a former student he once taught, in a coworker years ago, in a stranger on a train he'd regretted not speaking to. He wasn't about to repeat that mistake. "Hey," he said softly, not wanting to startle her. "It's okay, really." She nodded quickly, too quickly, as if agreeing might keep the peace. Her hands trembled as she bagged the groceries. Not enough for anyone in a hurry to notice, but Mark had slowed down. He was fully watching now. Behind him, someone joined the line. Alyssa's breath caught, and she redoubled her pace, moving faster, more frantic. Beep. Sorry. Mark raised a hand slightly, not to stop her, but to ground the moment. You're doing fine, he said quietly. You don't have to apologize. The words surprised her. She froze mid-motion, her fingers gripping the plastic bag until her knuckles turned white. She finally looked at him, really looked at him, and for a moment, the facade slipped. He saw exhaustion, fear, something close to shame. Lily reached toward her again, offering her giraffe. It earned the smallest, saddest smile Mark had ever seen. Thank you, Alyssa whispered, but it wasn't addressed to him exactly, not fully. It sounded like gratitude for being seen, even if only for a second. Then she blinked hard and returned to scanning. As she handed him the final bag, her sleeve slipped once more, and this time Mark noticed another bruise, barely visible above the first. A pattern, not random, not accidental. He didn't comment, not yet. Instinct told him pushing her would only make her retreat. Instead, he steadied his voice. Long day, he asked gently. She swallowed. They're all long. It wasn't an answer, not really, but it wasn't nothing either. Mark held her gaze for a moment longer, offering the kind of quiet reassurance he wished someone had given him when he'd first lost his wife, when he'd felt alone, overwhelmed, trying to smile through the ache. Alyssa looked down quickly, biting her lip, and whispered the word again, barely audible. Sorry. And in that moment, Mark knew something deeper than fatigue lay behind it, something no teenager should carry on her shoulders. But he also knew she wasn't ready to say more. Not yet. Alyssa's last, sorry, lingered in the air long after she handed Mark the receipt. It was fragile, too fragile, like a thin thread holding together something that was quietly falling apart. Mark didn't move for a moment. Behind him, someone cleared their throat impatiently. He stepped aside, giving the next customer space, but he didn't walk away. Not yet. Lily rested her head on his shoulder, sensing the heaviness of the moment the way children sometimes did, intuitively and without understanding. Mark rocked her gently, eyes still on Alyssa as she mechanically began scanning the next set of groceries. The same nervous tension, the same flinch at the beeps, the same whispered apologies. He couldn't just leave. He waited until her line cleared again, then approached slowly, not too close, not too sudden. He remembered what it felt like to be overwhelmed, how even kindness could feel like pressure when you were barely holding on. Hey, he said softly. Are you okay? She stiffened, hands pausing over the register keys. For a second, she looked like a deer caught between running and collapsing. Then her eyes darted around, toward the manager's desk, toward the security cameras, toward the entrance, as if checking where danger might come from next. I'm fine, she said quickly. Too quickly. I'm just tired. Mark nodded, but he didn't look away. I get tired too. Single dad. Long days. He bounced Lily lightly on his hip. But tired doesn't usually look like that. Her throat bobbed as she swallowed. Tears pooled but didn't fall, held back by a practiced kind of restraint. I'm sorry, she whispered again, voice breaking. And it broke something in Mark, too. You don't have to apologize, he said gently. Not to me. Alyssa pressed her lips together. Her hands trembled again, but this time she didn't hide them. For a long moment, she stood completely still. Then, as if her strength cracked open all at once, she let out a shaky exhale. It's just, she faltered. I say sorry a lot. Makes things easier. The phrasing was careful, chosen, words that revealed more than she meant them to. Mark kept his voice low. Easier for who? She looked away, blinking rapidly, trying to steady herself before she spoke. My dad, she said finally, barely audible. He gets angry. Over everything. Saying sorry first means he doesn't get as mad. Mark felt the weight of her words settle deep inside him. Not anger, though that simmered there, quiet and controlled, but sorrow. And a fierce protectiveness he hadn't expected to feel for someone he'd only just met. He shifted Lily to his other arm and moved a little closer, not invading, but offering presence. That's not okay, he said softly. Alyssa let out a humorless laugh, short and shaky. It's normal, she muttered. He's always been like that. Everyone gets upset sometimes. Mark shook his head gently. Not like that, not enough to make you afraid to speak. Or afraid to make noise. Or afraid to exist. Alyssa's breath hitched. She wiped at her eye with the corner of her sleeve, but the tears came faster now, no longer contained by polite smiles or forced apologies. I don't want him to be mad, she whispered. If he gets mad, he throws things. Or slams doors. Or grabs my arm. But it's not like he hurts me. Not really. That bruise, Mark said quietly. The one on your wrist. She froze. Her sleeve slid instinctively down again. Shame cast over her expression, heavy and undeserved. It was an accident, she said quickly. He was just trying to get my attention. Does he apologize? Mark asked. The question hit her like cold water. She shook her head slowly, eyes dropping to the counter. No, she admitted. He says it's my fault. Because I talk back, or I don't listen, or I make him upset. Mark exhaled a long, steady breath. He remembered reading something once about how people started believing the things they heard often enough. How kids raised on blame eventually learned to choke on their own voices. None of that is your fault, he said firmly, soft, but unwavering. People who love you don't hurt you for being human. Alyssa wiped her cheeks again, but new tears replaced the old ones. I shouldn't be telling you this, she whispered. I don't want to cause trouble. You're not causing trouble, Mark said. You're asking for help, even if you don't realize it yet. She looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time without fear blocking her view. Mark saw something in her eyes then, exhaustion, desperation, but also a tiny flicker of hope. Fragile but present. What if he finds out I said something? She whispered. He won't, Mark said gently. Not unless you want someone to know. She hesitated. What if I do want someone to know? But I'm scared. That just means you're human, he said. And brave. Alyssa shook her head. I'm not brave. You are, Mark insisted. You've survived things most people never have to face. That makes you stronger than you realize. Her lower lip trembled. I don't know what to do, she admitted. I don't want to go home, but I don't want to leave my little brother there alone. How old is he? Mark asked. 10, she whispered. He hides in his room when Dad's angry. But Dad doesn't hit him. Just yells a lot. Yelling counts, Mark said. Kids feel it even if it's not aimed at them. Alyssa hugged herself. I don't know where we'd go. There are people who can help, Mark said. Safe places, resources, even just someone you can talk to. She shook her head fearfully. He'd find out. He always does. And he'd be worse. Mark stood there, thinking. He didn't want to push her too far too fast. But he also couldn't ignore what she had just shared. It wasn't his place to force decisions, but it was his place, as a decent human being, to offer safety where he could. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small scrap of paper, a receipt, folded. With a pen borrowed from the nearby lottery form stand, he wrote his number on it. He slid it across the counter, not touching her hand, giving her space. This is mine, he said. You don't have to call. You never have to. But if you ever feel unsafe, or you need someone to talk to, or you're scared, you can call me. Anytime. Alyssa stared at the paper like it was a lifeline she wasn't sure she was allowed to take. What if it's late? She asked in a whisper. Then I'll wake up, Mark said simply. What if you're busy? Then I'll stop. What if? Her voice cracked. What if I'm wrong? What if I'm just overreacting? Mark leaned in slightly, meeting her eyes with steady, unshakable calm. You're not wrong. And you're not alone. A tiny sob escaped her, barely audible. She folded the paper quickly and slipped it into her pocket, holding it like something precious. Thank you, she whispered, voice trembling but honest. No one's ever asked or listened. Mark gave a small, gentle smile. Sometimes all we need is one person who does. She nodded, brushing away tears. For the first time, her breathing slowed. Her shoulders loosened, not healed, not even close, but lighter. Be safe tonight, Mark said as he adjusted Lily on his hip. Alyssa nodded again. You too. As Mark walked out of the store, the fading sun warm on his back, he held his daughter a little tighter. He knew he couldn't fix everything. He knew Alyssa's story wasn't magically better because he cared. But he also knew something else. Sometimes the smallest acts, listening, noticing, offering help, become the turning point in someone's life. And behind the checkout counter, with a folded piece of paper pressed to her chest, Alyssa whispered one last, sorry. But this time, her voice didn't break. And she didn't mean it for herself.